TX Factor is brought to you in association with Martin Lynch & Sons, the world's favourite ham store. And the Radio Society of Great Britain is proud to sponsor TX Factor.
Hello and welcome to TX Factor, the only UK TV show dedicated to all things radio. We're here at Media Concepts where the shows are edited and we're just doing the final bits of post-production for episode 14. We thought we'd record this bit indoors because, well, it's the middle of winter and it's snowing outside. In this episode, we continue our series on propagation and Steve Nichols picks up where Jim Bacon left off. Steve's domain is space weather and how the conditions between 50 and 300 miles into the Earth's atmosphere affect our ability to communicate on the HF band, especially during this period of low sunspot activity. Our free to enter draw is back and we have a copy of Steve Nichols' book Radio Propagation Explained to give away. At the end of last year, we spent a few days at Hamfest 2016 and spoke to many enthusiastic people connected with all aspects of the hobby of amateur radio. And in this show, we bring news of the RSGB's Train the Trainers initiative, and we speak with Cathy Clark from Raynet to see how this important organisation is faring in today's high-tech world. But first, back to propagation, and you may recall in the last episode, Jim Bacon gave us some excellent explanations on tropospheric ducting and sporadic E, and how the weather at low levels affects these phenomena. Bob McCready takes up the story. Cue Bob.
But for the HF operator, Steve, it's a different kind of weather we're talking about, isn't it? Because we're leaving earthbound weather behind and now boldly going into the realms of space weather.
Absolutely. Jim, as I said, was interested in the lower first few miles, if you like, of the atmosphere. What we're interested in is what happens from 50 up to maybe 300 miles or even higher in the atmosphere, or more particularly the ionosphere, the very, very reaches of our atmosphere before we turn into space.
So when in the history of radio did people begin to understand how the ionosphere worked?
Well, the funny thing, if we go back to 1901 when Marconi crossed the Atlantic, theory was at that point that radio travelled in straight lines and that was it. There was some indication that that wasn't the case when he was transmitting from the Isle of Wight to Bass Point and Poldhu, because that couldn't have been line of sight because it was over the horizon. So there's a kind of an indication at that point that something was happening. And he, of course, then transmitted from Poldhu to Newfoundland, which is effectively through a body of hundreds of miles worth of water. So there was obviously something going on, although nobody really knew what. There was then in the 1910s and 20s theories that maybe there was a reflective layer in the atmosphere, which then became known as the ionosphere, and that led to research, Kennelly and Heaviside, and then back into the 1920s and 30s with Appleton to actually find these layers as they were. And yes, we discovered them using various techniques. Which the first one that was discovered was the E layer. It was called E because it was an electric field, and that gave them some room to add other letters. Then, of course, we got the F layer, F1, F2 layer, and then the lower D layer, which is an absorption layer. So around about the 1930s, the idea came about that there were these ionospheric layers that were reflecting radio waves, and that's when the research really got going.
So at which point did we begin to understand what influences the layers and what actually happens to them?
You start off with observations, and observations were that things seemed to get better when there were more sunspots, and things were better on certain bands during the day when the sun was up, and at other bands at night when the sun was away. So it soon became apparent that the sun must have some sort of effect in this, or was at least part of the whole process. And then that leads to more and more research, And yes, you then start to look at sunspot cycles and sunspot numbers, and the whole model starts to build in terms of what's going on, which is the way science really works, I think.
Wow, so it all starts with the sun. It's our star that controls HF propagation.
Yeah, if we didn't have the sun, I mean, life on Earth wouldn't exist anyway, but in terms of amateur radio, at the HF bands at least, it's all important. And the sun is a massive gaseous ball of hydrogen, helium. It's actually a plasma. It's so hot, billions of degrees hot. So it's not atoms as we know. It's ions. And what we noticed back in the early days, very very early days, was that now and again it had black spots on it. This information goes right the way back to way before the 18th century, and I think we started getting records of sunspots back in the 1750s. So we knew there were these sunspots. What we didn't know was what they were. And what we do know now is that they are areas of magnetic flux, if you like, the magnetic distortions. And one of the reasons for this is that the sun rotates on average about every 27 days, but it actually rotates faster at the equator than it does at the poles. And it's this twisting effect that winds up these magnetic fields, and ultimately something has to give and we get these sunspots. They look dark because they're cooler than the surrounding area, but don't be wrong about that. They're still, I think, something like 3,000 degrees Kelvin. They're incredibly hot, but cooler than the surroundings, while they look dark. And we realised over the years that there's about an 11-year cycle from a sunspot minimum, when you may have no sunspots whatsoever, to a sunspot maximum, when you could have absolutely loads of them. Now, it is an average of about 11.1 years, but you can have some cycles that are as short as maybe 7 years and some 16. Some cycles are an awful lot stronger than others as well. What they found was that these sunspots are a massive emitter of ultraviolet light. And it's this ultraviolet light and near X-ray light that causes the ionisation in the very, very thin parts of our atmosphere at heights of 100 to 300 miles.
Yeah, so the first requirement then that we have as radio amateurs is we want sunspots.
We want sunspots for the best results on the higher bands especially. We want sunspots, we want lots of them. At the moment, we're rather not exactly endowed with them. We're currently coming down from the peak of sunspot cycle 24, solar cycle 24, and we've come down that peak quite quickly. So there's not an awful lot about at the moment, and we should be heading for a minimum in about 2018, 2019, and then the cycle will build up again. If we look at a chart of the solar cycle progression, we can see that the peak, we had a double peak, one in about 2012, one in about 2014. And as you can see from the graph, it's not a smooth cycle at all. We have periods where there's a lot of sunspots, periods when there's not many sunspots at all. But you can definitely see there is a pattern there, and we are dropping down to this minimum about 2018, 2019. We've already had periods where there have been no sunspots whatsoever in this part of the cycle, and then a few days later we've had quite a few. But the more sunspots we get, more ionising radiation and the better conditions. That's simplifying it an awful lot, but that's essentially what it is.
So how well do we really understand the process of the cycle then? Because I'm imagining that so far we haven't managed to gather enough data to really understand what's going to happen.
Well, what you've got to bear in mind is that the sun has been shining for millions of years, if not billions of years, and we've probably got data that only goes back maybe 100, and really, really good data, maybe about 30, 40 years. So to look at our 30, 40 years worth of data and try and extrapolate what's going to happen in the next 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years is very, very difficult. We're understanding more about the sun every day, but I think if you've got a room full of solar physicists, they will argue about what the next cycle is going to be. I mean, for example, solar cycle 24, the peak wasn't a particularly good one compared with the previous cycle. If we look at the graph, you can see that we had sunspot number was around about 175 in 2001, 2002. I mean, back then you could talk to New York on 10 meters every day without a problem. We had a sunspot peak of about 100, sunspot number of about 100 in 2012, 2014, and now it's falling off, and those higher bands are just not open anymore. And that is not going to get better, to be honest, as we go towards the minimum.
Oh dear. So where do we look to get the information?
Okay, the first thing you need to know is how many sunspots do we have. We've got two ways of really looking at this. We can either count the number of sunspots and come up with what we call a sunspot number. There's a method of doing this that counts the number of sunspots and counts the number of groups. So you get 10 points for a group, 1 point for a sunspot. So one sunspot in one group, we say that's a sunspot number of 11. So it doesn't mean there's 11 sunspots, it means there's one sunspot in one group. We have 2 separate groups with 1 sunspot on each, so that becomes 22. So this number that we have tells us, roughly how many sunspots there are. There's another way of doing it. We can't measure the ultraviolet output from the sun on Earth because the ozone layer and the atmosphere absorbs it. What we did find years ago was that if we measured the amount of energy coming off the sun at 10.7 centimetre wavelength, there's a strong correlation between that and the ultraviolet output. So we use this measure, it's called the solar flux index, as a measure of the electromagnetic output from the sun. And we talk about the SFI, or solar flux index, and solar minimum, that could have a figure of about 66. I think that's about as low as it goes, 65, 66. Solar maximum, it could be up to 300. So we need to know that number to start with. So that's our starting point. What is the solar flux index?
And the higher the better for us.
The higher the better. At the moment, I think it's around about 80. And you can get that information from a website called solarham.net. We'll put this in the show notes for you, but the daily sunspot number, the sunspot number at the moment is 54. Again, it doesn't mean there's 54 sunspots, it means a number of groups with sunspots in them. And the solar flux index today was 82. That's not very, very good, to be honest, but that gives us a starting point. What we've also found over the years is that if we just take a daily sunspot number and try and base our predictions on that, it varies from day to day. And you may find the conditions don't actually change that much. So what they found over the years is it's better to use what we call a smooth sunspot number, an averaged sunspot number for a month, and use that to do our predictions. So the smooth sunspot number for August at the moment is about 35. So that's the number we will use with some of our prediction programs, which we haven't talked about yet, to actually work out what conditions are going to be like. So the first thing to do is find out what the solar flux index is, or the smooth sunspot number. You can use either. The next thing we need to know is what about the particulate output from the sun. The sun is throwing off plasma all the time. We call it the solar wind. Now at certain times that can be an awful lot stronger and heavier and faster than others. At the moment we're suffering from a problem called coronal holes. These are areas on the sun with much reduced magnetic fields. So they're like holes in the sun that let the plasma pour out. Now plasma and HF propagation, you would think, go very well together. They don't. As this plasma hits the Earth, it gets channeled towards the poles. We can end up with a lot of plasma in what we call the magneto tail, and at times that can pour into the poles and we get aurora. So on the whole, when we get all this plasma hitting the Earth, initially you can get an enhancement, what we call a pre-geomagnetic storm enhancement, but overall it drives the maximum usable frequencies down, causes noisy bands, really absorbs any propagation over the poles, so high amounts of plasma is not good. And we measure that by measuring how much the Earth's magnetic field is being affected, how much it's being distorted. And the 2 ways of doing that, one is something called the A index, which is a measure over 24 hours worldwide of how much this magnetic field is being distorted, and it's a linear number, so it goes from sort of 0 to 400 or so. The other way of doing it is something called the K index, which is a logarithmic method that looks over the last 3 hours. So if you want to know what current conditions are, use the K index, and that usually goes from about 1 to 9.
And that's the one you use in your GBT?
We generally use, yeah, we generally talk about the K index because you could have a situation where the A index is very low, but that's for the last 24 hours, when in fact we've just had a massive geomagnetic storm. The K index has hit 7, but the A index wouldn't tell you that. So we find it's easier to use the K index because that's more up to date. And we've got charts of the K index as well. Again, you can get those from solarham.com. And as you can see from this at the moment, the K index this week has been, sometimes down to 1, once down to 0, but around about 2, 3. That's a little bit disturbed, but not terribly disturbed. If the K index hits 5, or higher, that's usually a sign that we've had a massive input of plasma from the sun. That's when you're going to start getting aurora, which is not good for HF because it tends to close the bands down, as I said, reduce the maximum usable frequencies. But of course, VHF enthusiasts then start to use auroral propagation. So, while it's bad for HF, it can be good for VHF. So we need to know the solar flux index, sunspot number, and we need to know the K index. Now, that's okay for now. But what about next week, and when we do GB2RS? Although you hear it or read it on Sunday, we actually prepare it on Friday. So we're doing it for Friday for the following week. So what do we do from that? Well, we know that the sun rotates in 27 days. So we can look at some of the imagery of the sun. We know it rotates. Some sunspot areas and areas where there have been what we call coronal mass ejections, where lots of plasma have been thrown out, are still going to be there when it comes around again 27 days later. Basically, this is an image of the sun in extreme ultraviolet and X-ray light. And you can see these dark patches, which are cooler areas, lower energy areas of the sun. And that's due to this magnetic field being open with its plasmas firing out. So you can't see the plasma, but we can deduce from this that there's plasma coming out. And as that rotates into a geoeffective position, we know that 24, 48 hours later, it's going to hit the Earth. K-index will go up, conditions won't be so good, might get aurora. A little bit imprecise, and we often get the day wrong. You know, I think I once said, oh, conditions are going to be really bad on Thursday, and they were bad on Wednesday. Because, you know, the plasma was going to end up travelling a lot faster than we thought. But we get a general idea. At this point in the solar cycle, coronal holes are very, very prevalent. So that the main driver of propagation at the moment is when we get these coronal holes, the K-index goes up, conditions are generally not that good. As we slide down to sunspot minimum, we're hoping that coronal hole effects will probably diminish an awful lot. We may have more settled conditions. But on the whole, so the more sunspots we get, the more electromagnetic energy, the higher frequency we can use. So at this point in the sunspot cycle, 20 meters is going to be open during the day, but 15 and 10 meters other than sporadic E are probably not going to be open. So we can tell from this what bands will be open and when.
And we'll rejoin Steve to conclude our series on propagation later in the show. And if you'd like to read more on this fascinating subject, we have a copy of Steve's book, Radio Propagation Explained, to win in our free to enter draw. See our website, txfactor.co.uk, for terms and conditions and how to enter. Coming up next, Bob debates whether to get his wallet out at Hamfest.
The Radio Society of Great Britain is proud to be a sponsor of TX Factor. The Society is dedicated to the development of the science and practice of amateur radio. It works to increase awareness and understanding of amateur radio and to make the hobby accessible to everyone. The RSGB has been in existence since 1913 and continues to look after the interests of thousands of licensed amateurs and shortwave listeners in the UK and throughout the world. The RSGB publishes Radcom, a monthly magazine, and a number of books on radio-related subjects including electronics, antennas and propagation. See the RSGB website for more information on how the Society can work for you. Hello and welcome to Hamfest 2016 here in Newark, and look at this fantastic crowd all around the TX Factor stand. They're so keen to see us. Actually, no, it's not our stand. It's the RSGB bookstall, who had the cunning plan of doing an offer whereby if you spent over a certain amount of money, you got a free RSGB backpack while stocks last. The doors only opened a couple of minutes ago, and you see everybody trying to avail themselves of the offer. And that's often what these shows are all about, those special show bargains that you can pick up here that you can't get the rest of the year, and those hard to find bits and bobs, those components you've been looking for all year. And in fact, there is something I found out on the flea market. I don't know if it's still there, but I'll take you to see it. And I'm humming and hawing. Something I've hankered after for years because I had one when I was younger. Maybe I'll buy one today. That's the fun of Hamfest. The thing about old radio gear is what one man thinks is a fantastic treasure, somebody else looks at and goes, what do you want that rusty old thing for? And I'm very disappointed that the rest of the team here at TX Factor couldn't see how excited I am about this 38 set AFV. Right, now Len, where did you get this from?
Well, I've been collecting for years, and I buy something, sell something, and just keep building the collection up that way.
I got my first one of these when I was about 15 years old from a shop in Southend, and it came in the original warp department, packing with all the tar on it and everything.
Trouble is now getting anything that's not modified.
They do like to get their screwdrivers in there, don't they?
They do, don't they? Yeah, it's very, very unusual now to get mint unmodified. vintage radio equipment.
So how much do you want for this one?
125.
125 quid?
I think you'll find in
Now this is it. Is the nostalgia worth £125? What do you think?
Okay.
It's a deal. It's a deal.
Okay. Can you shake on it?
Yeah, go on then.
So,
There, a happy man. Look at that. That is a treasure. Now, I know it doesn't look much to you, but to me, it means quite a lot. The one thing I don't know, of course, is whether it works or not, but we'll find that out when we get home, and that's part of the fun of buying stuff like this from the flea market. And when it comes to old radios like this, if it doesn't work, another big part of the fun is getting it to work.
So I'm here with Philip Willis from the RSGB Tech and Education Committee. What's all that about, Phil?
Well, RSGB puts a lot of effort into training and education, and we work alongside the exams group, which deliver the exams part, and with the youth committee. Our role mainly is to do with the training side, working with schools, working with clubs, working with regional managers. What we deliver is lots of support, and our main project at the moment is the Schools Link project, which ties into the Principia event, the Tim Peake effect, as everyone likes to call it, and we're trying to build on that and follow up on that. So there are a couple of projects this year taking place in York and Portsmouth, led by the Principia team, and we'll be there. And we'll also be helping on the Outreach Day, where we'll be having a stand where the local schools come along and hopefully play along with some of the things we've got, and maybe we'll see some of the teachers there too.
Yeah, off the back of the Tim Peake effect and those ARIS contacts at the schools, youngsters are really getting fired up into getting into the hobby. What's your aim and how are you going to help them do that?
We have two things that we want to follow up on. One of them is indeed bringing the youngsters into the hobby, and that's part of our ongoing mission anyway. That's one of the reasons we work with our youth committee a lot. But the other thing, and this is something new for us, we're trying to work with the teachers themselves. So the Schools Link brief is really to try and help the teachers deliver their curriculum. So we want to provide support materials, we want to make sure they understand where wireless fits in with, for example, physics, and we hope to work with them. And we've made a good start with the main Principia schools, but one of the benefits of the Outreach Day is it reaches regional schools as well, even if they weren't directly involved with Tim Peake.
So now we've got the 10 schools really excited off the back of the ARIS contacts. They're going to play the game of amateur radio. How are you going to open it up to a bigger group of people and get them involved too?
Yes, that's the long-term plan. We're working with relatively limited numbers of schools at the moment, primarily the Principia ones, but we want to reach a much wider community than that. And that's one of the reasons we're focusing on teachers, because teachers do have varying needs, but there's a lot of stuff that they need to get done where we can help and support them, basically responding to them rather than us trying to impose things on them.
Yeah, it's great that some of the teachers have actually gotten involved into the hobby as well. I know at King's School, they're pushing ahead now with a radio group. They've got funding from an ESRO grant, and the head of IT there has just passed his foundation exam. So when you've got teachers fired up and staff at the school about the hobby, that's got to be great for you guys, right?
Yes, it has, because that gives us a nucleus within that particular school, helps us to build the enthusiasm, but more to the point, they can then act as a focus in the area for other schools who can come and perhaps see what they've been doing, and hopefully that will spread the word. So that's the best way really of getting it out there, just get a few people who can show that the benefits within schools to other schools.
Back in the day, the RCF used to be in control of the examinations. Now the RSGB's taken over. What changes might they be making?
Well, there is a syllabus review on at the moment, but I think the levels are likely to stay the same. What happens within those levels may well change, and we're hoping that there'll be an announcement at some near date about exactly where we've got to with the whole syllabus review. Training and Education Committee obviously has representatives involved with that, but so does the Exam Committee and others. So.
Now the hobby's constantly evolving, so are the exams. How are you keeping the trainers up to speed with everything that's kind of going on in the hobby?
Yes, we've had a very successful program which is still running to try and help trainers bring themselves up to date, primarily on teaching methods. The technology itself certainly moves on, and that offers new opportunities for teaching. And so we really want to just spend a day with the trainers, bringing them up to date on what you're trying to do when you teach someone generally, and then how you can make use of what we currently have in the technology to help. And in some cases, things you can just do that maybe you just do a little bit different, which we know that works as well. We typically have up to around 20 people on a trainer-trainers course, and the enthusiasm that they show at the end of the day is incredible. The first few, the feedback, we were overwhelmed with positive feedback, and that has continued wherever we've gone with this project. So
that's what you need. You need that passion, don't you?
Oh, you do.
And the drive to
Yes.
do it. If I wanted to become a trainer, how do I go about doing it?
Well, there's nothing to stop you working perhaps with your local club if they do training already and just doing it informally. But what I would recommend is maybe having dropped your toe in the water, as it were, doing that kind of thing, that you try and come along to one of these events. We do hold them up and down the country. We do try and spread them around. We do have more demand than we can supply at the moment, which is good. But equally, if your club wants to host one, please get in touch.
So what's the best way of getting in contact with you?
Probably contact me in the first instance. There is an email address for the training and education.
That's now whizzing along the bottom of the screen.
Okay, so the email address is the thing that they should use to get in touch with me, unless of course they happen to see me at an event like this, in which case by all means say hello.
I've got Cathy Clark from Raynet with me right now, and not a lot of people know this, but back in the day when I was a spotty 17-year-old, I had a Raynet ID card and I was an active member of Raynet too. If I remember rightly, we had a group controller, there were district controllers, and I think there was a national controller. Is that the kind of way it still is now?
It is very similar, yes. Back in those days, of course, it was the RSGB, National Raynet Committee. And then in 1992, we split away from the RSGB and became our own entity as the Radio Amateurs Emergency Network. But things are becoming really going full circle now, and we are beginning to start the reunification of Raynet under one umbrella organisation.
And I think there's two groups coming together now, right? How's that going to affect Raynet, and what's the new group going to be called?
Well, hopefully, if it all goes forward to our AGM at the end of October, it will become Raynet UK, but we'll still be known as Raynet. But effectively, getting everybody together and similar and completely unified training, everything, to become a more effective organisation.
Does Raynet get any funding for doing what it wants to do?
No, all our funding is still coming from donations from doing events. We don't get any national funding at all, so we really have to be self-sufficient to do the work that we want. Having said that, we've recently had a grant from SSE Power Distribution of £20,000, and that's been used to build a communications trailer down in Sussex, which is available to everyone in the south of England, all the Raynet groups. And in fact, we used it a couple of weeks ago on a big event that we had.
Well, that's fantastic having SSE on board with their branding and their nationalisation. That's brilliant for Raynet. Now, when you guys get called out in an emergency, not a lot of people realise this, you can be the lifeline in a life or death situation, right?
Absolutely, yes, because one of the things that we are is totally infrastructure independent. So we don't need power, we don't need radio equipment, we don't need masts, mobile phone masts or anything. We can put in that infrastructure to help in an emergency.
Now you guys are on call 24/7, so when the phone rings, can you guys group together really quickly?
Yes, I mean one of the things we have is a national telephone helpline which is manned 24/7, and we can direct the resources exactly to where they're needed.
So there's an emergency happening, people need to call you as soon as possible. Do the councils know how to get in touch with Raynet quickly?
In the whole, yes. I mean, we're written into so many emergency plans that they know how to contact us. And the proviso is they make contact with the local group first, and then if they are unsuccessful, then they would go to the emergency helpline.
Now when you guys go out on a shout and you're about to set up all your equipment and you turn up with your team, how are you treated? Are you still looked upon as like a bunch of amateurs?
I hate using the word amateur. We really are much, much more than that. We are professional. And sometimes we're treated with a bit of scepticism. Oh, you can't do what we can do, but we soon prove them.
Thankfully, we don't actually have that many national and local emergencies in this country. So I guess you guys get out to a lot of local and regional events too, right?
And the reason that we do those sorts of events is because it's bread and butter for us. It's, in the field training, And the thing is, when an event goes well, the buzz you get from it is amazing.
Now down to the nitty-gritty of new recruits. Are you getting lots of youngsters into RayNet?
It's always difficult with youngsters. They do tend to join RayNet and then disappear after exams and they go off to universities. A lot of our membership is actually the sort of middle-aged people who maybe have a bit more time on their hands after their families have grown up and they're allowed to go back and play radio again.
So getting involved in a RayNet exercise, that's got to really help your radio operating techniques, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You have to get that message across accurately and in a timely manner. Otherwise, it could be a really life or death situation.
And we hope to cover a RayNet exercise in a future edition. On TX Factor Next, we conclude our series on propagation with Steve Nichols. At Martin Lynch & Sons, the world's favourite ham store, we're on the lookout. In fact, we're looking for 3 new recruits, a senior workshop engineer, an accounts assistant, and a Saturday salesperson. All 3 positions will be based at our new store in Staines-upon-Thames near Heathrow Airport. We've been established for over 25 years and pride ourselves in offering the best customer service, range and price in the industry. Would you like to be part of our specialist team? If so, we'd love to hear from you. See our website for full details on the qualifications and experience required and to check our amazing range of ham radio products and special deals. Martin Lynch & Sons, the world's favourite ham store. Come and join us.
Do the seasons have an effect? Does propagation change through the year?
Propagation between 2 points, it gets very complex. It will depend upon where those 2 points are on the Earth, what time of day is it and what time of year it is. For example, in the Northern Hemisphere in the summer, you would think with all the extra sun that we get that things would be an awful lot better. After all, we want sunlight. Therefore, the more sun we get, the more ionisation we should get. It doesn't quite work like that. In the summer, in the Northern Hemisphere, what you find is maximum usable frequencies are actually lower in the day than they are in the winter. The reason for this, we believe it to be the ionospheric chemistry changes. There's more diatomic molecules in the ionosphere in the summer and they're harder to ionise. So at this time of year, the ionosphere is a lot hotter. We actually find conditions are not so good. We call it the summer doldrums, but in the winter, ionosphere cools down a bit. We then have more monatomic oxygen and nitrogen. It's easier to actually ionise, so we find that maximum usable frequencies are higher in the winter than they are in the summer. Conversely, what you also find is in the winter the bands close as soon as the sun goes down or shortly thereafter. But in the summer, nighttime maximum usable frequencies remain higher. So in the summer you may find 20 metres as open all night, where in the winter it won't be. So knowing what time of year it is and what you're trying to work is important. Because the way the seasons are, around March and September, when we've got the sun over the equator and both hemispheres are equally illuminated, that's the best time of year to work north-south paths, such as UK to South Africa, UK to South America. Whereas in the late autumn, October, that's a better time to work from the UK to North America. So as I said, when you're trying to do a propagation prediction, you need to know what path you want to work, what time of year and what time of day. When we're having our winter, so we've got higher MUFs in during the day in the winter. Of course, down in the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite, so they have lower MUFs, which is why these equinox times of March and September are better for these north-south paths. But if you're trying to work from here to the States, if you try and do that in the summer, you'll find it very, very hard. But come October, late October, I can pretty much guarantee that you'll be working the States, on 20 metres in the afternoon. So we need the sun, but we also need the sun to be in the right place. So on a path from the UK to North America, we want the sun to be somewhere between the two. We want the sun somewhere over the Atlantic. So 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that kind of period, is the best time to work the States on, say, 20 metres. Where if you're trying to work towards the east, you're trying to work the far side of Russia, or you're trying to work Japan or China, the morning would be better because you want the sun in that direction. So on the higher bands at least, you want the sun to be illuminating that area. Of course, with the lower bands at night, I didn't mention this, but of course we also get what we call D-layer absorption. So the sun is shining on the D layer, the E layer and the F layer. The D layer is the lowest layer of the lot and it's really an absorption layer. So that stops HF signals getting through it. So this is why during the day in the summer the lower bands are noisier and you can't really get the distances that you want. In the winter the D-layer absorption is a lot less, so it's much better for distance work. And the easiest way to see this is really medium wave radio. If you listen on medium wave during the day, you'll hear stations in a kind of radius of about 50 miles, maybe a little bit further, but nothing from the continent. At night, when the sun sets and the delay disappears, all of a sudden you're hearing stuff coming in from the continent, from Europe. And that's a perfect example of how this delay absorption, results in the lower bands being useless during the day, but coming into their own at night. So 80 meters is much better for DX at night. 40 meters is much better for DX at night as well. And of course, top band 1.8 megs is better for DX at night as well.
So the question all amateurs are asking at the moment, Steve, is why have conditions been so poor for the last few months?
Okay, we've got a triple effect really on this one. First, it's been summer. So we've got the summer doldrums of HF, so we've got lower maximum usable frequencies. So that's why we are not really hearing much above maybe 14 megahertz. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that we've got these coronal hole effects. We've had a whole succession of coronal holes every week virtually in GB2RS. I'm talking about coronal hole effects. All this plasma coming out, reducing maximum usable frequencies, making the bands noisy and causing polar cap absorption really for signals that have to go over the North Pole. And of course then the third whammy is this point in the solar cycle, we're not getting enough ionization, we're not getting enough ultraviolet light to give us the kind of ionization that we need to open up those higher bands. What you will find as we head into September and later into September, October, November, bands will actually improve dramatically, and we'll find that the maximum usable frequencies will go up, and you'll be able to use 14 megahertz, 18 megahertz, hopefully 21 megs. Not sure about 10 meters, really need the solar flux a little bit higher than that. But on general sort of paths to the States and paths to South America, as we head in towards late September, October, conditions will get an awful lot better.
As we go into the solar minimum then, is it going to be a case of, well, just forget HF because it's going to be useless? Or are there things that we can do that will help to maximise the number of QSOs we can get despite the conditions?
I think if we just said 10 metres won't be open full stop at solar minimum, don't go anywhere near it, that would be wrong. It's all about probability. When we do forecasts, propagation forecasts, we're talking about the probability of a contact. So the probability of a contact on a really good band, good day, maybe 90, 100% or thereabouts. By the time we get to maybe solar minimum, maybe 10 metres at say October, we may say have a 10%, 5%, 10% probability of a contact across the Atlantic. That means that over a period of 30 days, there may be 1 or 2 days when you can make that contact. Now that may not be for very long, may only be for 10 minutes or half an hour, but the probability is there. So don't write the bands off completely. It's just we're not going to get those massive openings on 10 metres at solar minimum when you could work Australia on a piece of wet string. And everyone's from the old days got those stories of working Australia on 3 watts with a dummy load. But the bands will be open, just not as often as they are or have been at solar maximum. Also, the other way of looking at it is the lower bands will come into their own. There'll be less D-layer absorption, so things like top band 1.8, 3.5, 7 megs will be providing really, really good propagation. And 20 meters always provides good propagation. It's like one of the, mustn't forget 10 megs either, which is often overlooked. But it's those bands that will come into their own towards solar minimum. So we maybe put more emphasis on the lower bands at those times than the higher ones.
A good time to focus on our antennas then, Steve, because I imagine with propagation being poor, we need to maximise the efficiency of our antennas and get the best antenna up that we can for the size of our plot.
Yeah, I mean, it's we say this all the time, but when it comes to radio, the antenna is the most important thing. We can spend a fortune on a really good radio, but if you put a 5p piece of string on it or wire, it's not going to work. So you do need, unfortunately, the best antenna you can get, coupled with the best radio you can get, and then some knowledge of what band to work and when. And this is when I think it's a good opportunity to look at some of the HF propagation prediction programs that are available to work out what you can work and when. One thing I haven't really mentioned is ionograms. This is one of the tools we use to work out what we might be able to do. You can register freely for this. This is the Chiltern ionogram near Harwell. It's run by the Rutherford Alton Laboratory. It doesn't cost you anything to register to use it, and it will update itself every 3 minutes with a look at the ionosphere. And basically it fires radio signals up and it sweeps from nothing, or virtually nothing, to 15 megahertz and sees what comes back. And from this we can see, this was a trace that's just been done, and we can see the various layers in action. So we can see that the F2 layer, we're getting a reflection from that, and the F2 layer is currently at around about 300 kilometers. And you can see there that nothing seems to be coming back at all once we go beyond about 6 megahertz. So what we actually say is the critical frequency, the frequency at which signals go straight up and get reflected and come back down again, is about 5.2 megahertz. And we can deduce an awful lot from that. That tells me instantly, if I'm trying to work somebody maybe in London or about 60 miles away, using 40 megs, 7 megs is no good whatsoever. The signals are just going to go straight up into space. If I come down to 5 megahertz, I will get a return. So all of a sudden, for these what we call NVIS, or near vertical incidence skywave signals, 5 megahertz suddenly comes into its own for working around the UK. It also tells us this critical frequency that we can extrapolate from that. So, well, okay, if we send our signal at a lower angle for DX, what sort of maximum usable frequencies over paths can we get? And the ionogram tells us that on about 3,000 kilometer path, the estimated maximum usable frequency is about 17 megs. So instantly that says to me, okay, if I'm trying to work some DX, 14 megahertz probably be okay, 18 megahertz possibly in some directions. We tend to think that the ionosphere is just a plain mirror. It's not. It's a turbulent mess of stuff that is changing all the time. Bits of it being illuminated one way, further around where the sun is, it's being illuminated from above. It's turbulent, it's moving very quickly, there's plasma coming all the time. It's a mess, to be honest. So these aren't totally accurate, but they're an indication. But just from that one ionogram, it tells me that 7 megs is no good for working around the UK, 5 megs would be very, very good. But if I want to work DX over a 3,000 kilometer path, I really need to be looking at 20 meters. Or if I wanted to work sort of 1,000 kilometers, 600 miles, 40 meters might just do it.
Now, I know that through your work with the RSGB, you've been doing some work on computer programs that will help predict propagation with more accuracy. How's that going?
Yeah, well, there's been a number of models over the years of ionospheric propagation. The most famous one is the VOACAP model. Started off as a program called IronCap, was then sponsored by Voice of America. And VOACAP is really the kind of industry standard, and it's very, very simple to use, because you basically tell it where you are, you tell it what day it is, tell it what antenna you're using, how much power, what mode, and it will give you a lovely graphical representation of the likelihood of you being able to make a contact. So for example, right this minute, it suggests that we'll be okay into North Africa and around Europe, maybe into Central Africa, but not so good being able to talk to the States. But so it's a model that you can either do what we call area coverage graphs like this, or we can do point-to-point propagation predictions. I'm just going to do one of those now, just so the idea of this is if you use a point-to-point one, you can basically try and work out the best time to make a contact. So if you're trying to work a de-expedition, say we're trying to work from the UK to South America, and we say what band we want, or location, power and everything, run the prediction, and it shows us that we're now at about 1600 UTC, that again 18 megahertz is probably the best band, but the likelihood is that we're going to have a much, much better chance of doing it in a couple of hours time, and it might even get up to 21 megahertz. Okay, so that was VOACAP, excellent tool and free for everyone to use. The ITU also had another program with a different ionospheric model that they've been working on for years, and it was called ITU HF Prop, a catchy little name. It wasn't easy to use at all. It had kind of text output, text input, and was grossly, I mean, I don't mean to be mean, but it wasn't a user-friendly program. We thought, wouldn't it be great to actually take that and make it more user-friendly, put it on the web for people to use? And so that was the basis of what has become PredTest at the moment. And so we've been developing PredTest, as it became, for RSGB, that uses the ITU model. to give similar graphical output. The ITU model is supposedly more accurate than VOACAM, and we're trying to design it for radio amateurs. So some of the results may look a little bit more pessimistic than VOACAM, but we think it more accurately describes the sort of thing that amateurs would see. At the moment, we can't adjust it for power or gain or anything, but we hope to do that in time. But predtest.uk, www.predtest.uk, there is a link from the RSGB website, is our first attempt at this. But again, it's free, it's web-based, which is what we wanted from the outset, and you can just go online, say, okay, what time of day is it, what band am I on, and you can look at the reliability of a signal. So this shows us right this minute that the reliability of working into Northern Africa is about 50%. We can look at the S meter, so it's saying that for 100 watts to a dipole, you're probably going to be seeing something like about S4, S5, and then we can look at the signal to noise ratio as well. Obviously, we need to have a signal to noise ratio greater maybe than say 30 dB, and so we can use that. And you can advance this hour by hour and see how the propagation changes. So it's another useful tool for radio amateurs to use on a daily basis to work out the best times to work various parts of the world on various bands.
Final question then, Steve. How can we as amateurs help you, the guys that are pulling all this together, to get the information you need?
I think in a number of ways. I think if you use the DX cluster and you report information, contacts on there, that can get used in things like DX maps. That's excellent. Use Whisper, because Whisper can produce maps as well that shows you how contacts are being made in real time. The reverse beacon network does exactly the same. So basically getting on the bands in the first instance, and these modern tools will actually pick up what you're doing and report it. That's good. So I think the ways you can help are tell us what you're working, absolutely. Use all the various online tools that you can, DX cluster, reverse beacon network, Whisper and the rest, and generally get interested. And we're always interested in anybody who wants to do some longer term research. So really, if you've got some interest in doing something on a longer term basis, do get in touch and we'll see if we can do something. Just getting interest, getting people on the bands, getting them to use them and getting them to find out more about what's happening and why. We don't thoroughly understand everything.
Thank you, Steve. We don't understand everything, but after Jim and Steve's excellent items, I, for one, understand a whole lot more. Well, that's it for this edition of TX Factor. We hope you've enjoyed the show. We'll be back again very soon. In the meantime, check out our website for detailed show notes and how to enter our free-to-enter draw with a chance to win a copy of Steve's book. Well, whatever the atmospheric conditions, we hope you have some great contacts. Until then, from all of us on the team, goodbye. This episode was brought to you in association with Martin Lynch & Sons, the world's favourite ham store, and the Radio Society of Great Britain, proud sponsors of TX Factor.